Great.
Alrighty, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Will and Friends Live. I have here with us Dr. Carl Hargrove, and we titled this conversation "Continuing the Conversation" in regards to everything that's going on right now. So, Dr. Hargrove, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad I have the opportunity to chat a little bit.
First off, before we get into it, how are you and your family in light of the coronavirus and everything like that? Is
Yeah,
everything okay? You guys
coronavirus,
safe and healthy?
safe, healthy. No one that we know had any bouts with it. Well, I shouldn't say no one that we know. No one in our family. There were a couple friends that had to work through it, but yeah, we remained healthy through the whole period. I suppose it's not officially over, but we're fine.
Right. It
Yeah,
almost feels like it is over, right? People
yeah, I
are
think so.
out and about now. Like the
That's
the
right.
masks aren't mandatory. It's
That's right.
recommended. Yeah. So that's very interesting there. So I'm happy to hear that you guys are healthy in that regard. And those who are joining us on Facebook, thank you so much for joining us. If you guys happen to have any questions in light of the conversation that we're having, feel free to post it. I will be checking the comment section there and making sure that we get that answered or being able to pass that on to Dr. Hargrove
Sure.
and getting that answer in the future. Um, but Dr. Hargrove, I saw your post that week, and it was a post in regards to George Floyd, but there was actually a multitude of things that was happening. It was
Yeah.
the week after Memorial Day weekend. We're supposed to be
Right.
celebrating, but there was multiple things that happened, and um, yeah, I just want to reach out to you, get your thoughts on how you were processing everything from a personal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So much happened over that weekend. And I think that post was initially something to the effect that the time when we should have been honoring,
Yes.
those who gave their lives for our country in military service on Memorial Day, it was somewhat stained by the dishonor of what had happened with George Floyd and some of the responses to it. And I say dishonor because in Memorial Day, we're recognizing those that gave their life in military service, the great freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States. And here's someone else who held an office, who held a place of authority as a police officer that dishonored, um, in one sense, his role and his calling. And it was sad to see that. And obviously, certain events that have taken place since then, some good and some horrible, in response to it. But in the end, I think we can try to learn from all of it. At least I hope we can. We should. But that's how it started. And then we had a little talk, and I've interacted with people a great deal about this since then, whether it be through social media, private conversations, and even yesterday, um, myself and some other men had a great discussion with John MacArthur about what the country is facing. And
Hmm.
even now, I think he's addressing the staff and faculty at the Master's Seminary and the Master's University now. So I couldn't be on that call because I'm here. And I'm sure tonight at our elders meeting at Grace Community Church, we'll discuss it even more. So it's in the forefront of everyone's mind at this point.
Wow, wow. Do you feel like as a pastor at Grace Community Church, or in your involvement in regards to the ministry there, this has been a conversation of discussion in the past, or I mean, obviously in light of the current events, more so now than in the past, but do you feel like that has been addressed before in the past?
No, we've discussed it, but just no one in our lifetime, I don't know, has seen anything like this.
Mm,
Not the event itself, but, well, I would say probably the event itself, because here it was that you saw a police officer essentially murder someone
right.
right before us in broad daylight.
Yeah.
We had seen other shootings, other incidents, some of it grainy, some of it barely captured, or either we heard about it or read about it, but to almost see it broadcast shocked many people. And
Mhm.
in the response to it, demonstrations, some peaceful, others not, and the fact that it was global and still remains that, no one has ever seen that. And of
Mhm.
course, this is all in the midst of COVID
Yeah.
um, and the pandemic that we're facing at the same time. It's also in light of, at that point in time, I'm not sure what the numbers are now, you had about 40 million people who were unemployed. What a time. Who's ever seen this before?
Right.
And I'm sure we'll all look back and say, I remember 2020 when these things happened. And we're not done. We're just at the midway point. So
Right.
who knows what else is in store? I don't know.
Right.
So, but
There's
we'll
like an
have to,
earthquake, there's gonna be a
yeah,
tsunami,
sure.
all these different
Yeah.
things. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
And we're not even in hurricane season yet. Literally, we're not, it's just starting right about now, hurricane
Mm.
season. So
Mhm.
who knows what's going to happen
Right.
around the world.
Going back to your comment in regards to George Floyd, and I know from Christian brothers and sisters or just neighbors, some people were very weary on calling it a murder or knowing how to describe that incident because, yes, you hear people on one perspective say he was in that position for a reason. There's no way cops should be, you should be in that predicament, right? And so not knowing what to call it, I don't know. What was your thought process? How would you
Yeah,
shepherd
sure.
your
Yeah,
church
and I'm
members
not,
in thinking
and
through that?
yeah, you look at it, and there are times. Let me say this: there should always be caution, because there are times when we get a bit of a video, a bit of a soundbite, and we draw conclusions. And one of the first things I remember learning, in my seminary study and dealing with, I think it was definitely my Greek class, and the professor said to us one of the most important. Let me give you the three most important words. And he said, here are the three most important words: context, context, context. So true. And so I think all of us have probably made unwise assessments or
Mm,
evaluations of something because we didn't have the fuller context yet. We see the end of it, we see the middle of it, we don't know what led to it, and we go ahead and make a statement. So we should be cautious.
mm,
The Proverbs tell us to be cautious, and that we should, in fact, be slow to speak, quick to listen. You know, one seems wise when they make their count until another comes along, and in one sense evaluates it. So that's proverbial wisdom in that. But in this case, and here's the other thing. Say, for instance, when we say murder, I'm not going to call it murder because he was indicted on that. Because there's another case right now that has unfolded in Atlanta
mm,
where a policeman shot someone, and he is right now has been indicted on murder, charged with murder.
mm,
I looked at that same video, and I don't personally, personal opinion here, that there is an atmosphere that I'm sure police officers are feeling right now that if anything like that happens, um, I'm going to be equated with what happened or what Derek Chauvin did, which
mm.
is very different.
Right.
Because if I look at the video of what happened in Atlanta and I say to myself, um, him under murder, I don't think so. But I look
Mhm,
at Derek Chauvin and there's enough video to see it. I don't know that anyone would deny that. Now, the language that's used, um, surely we can start with and agree that it's an injustice.
mm,
That should be evident to anyone that saw that video, that there was an injustice and an injustice with the three officers who did not intervene. Surely it was that. Now, is it manslaughter? Is it murder? Is it second degree? Um, hmm. Let's be cautious in it. But
mm,
let's start where we should all agree there is an injustice. Personally, I'm comfortable with saying it was a murder. Obviously not first degree because he didn't plot to kill the man. He
mm,
didn't say today I'm going to take the life of George Floyd. Although in the moment he may have actually been thinking that. I don't know. But the result is that George Floyd is no longer with us, and he
mhm,
should be. That's where we have to circle back and most certainly agree on. So when people say, what do I call it? Well, you wrestle with that in your own conscience. But I think your conscience should at least tell you that it was a grave injustice that happened. Yeah.
Right. Right. I think, and then that moves on to that second question in regards to the response. There's a lot of mixed responses out there after that, after the murder of George Floyd, and some people were vocalizing that on social media. Some people were posting about it, and some people kept silent. Some people didn't know what to say, or yeah, there's a mixed response. And then there's certain groups that are saying that you shouldn't be quiet, you shouldn't be silent in this manner in light of this situation, or you should be, the way you respond wasn't to the level of
Sure.
what I expected it to be.
Sure.
As followers of Jesus Christ, what are your thoughts there in regards to
Yeah,
that, in
that's a
regards to what
great
our response
question.
should be?
Sure, it's a great question. And even this morning, I did a call with men that are in the Mid-Atlantic area, and we were discussing some of those issues then through Zoom. What should the response be? First, that there should be, I think, let's start with compassion.
Hmm.
Compassion for a life that's lost, and whatever family connections he has because of that. So let's start there. There should be a sense, it should trouble us as an individual that this happened. And then my response should also be, let me not draw every conclusion from what occurred. Like, what can happen? Well, it's obvious that it was racist. I don't know that it was, but I don't know
Hmm.
that it wasn't either. And in one sense, that's not my priority to determine that. Um, I want to determine what should be the consequences for this officer who took this man's life. If there's something in his past or in his present that would evidence that he had animosities towards certain people, then that should be taken into account when he's sentenced. But that's not the priority for me to determine that. So I think another response might be simply, I don't know that silence is the response.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why that would be a response. Some might have it and they may say to themselves, well, I need to be silenced because I need to wait for all the facts to come out.
Yeah.
And I think that's highly appropriate in many situations. We do. But I think there is just this element of common sense and
Hmm.
that would tell us based on what we saw, there's a sufficient amount of clear evidence that that was an injustice. Now, we can have further discussion about to what level should they pay, what should be their consequences, but let's start there. I don't see how silence is a Christian response in this.
Hmm.
What surely isn't a Christian response is rioting and looting.
Hmm.
Now, I'm really disappointed by some leaders who have almost excused that behavior by saying you should expect it because of a history of injustice or oppressions that have taken place. Therefore, it's a volcano that simply erupted, and it would not have erupted had there been equity for decades in these communities. I don't buy that. It's thoroughly
Hmm.
not biblical. It's not. We are called to be a people, just Christians. Now, for the world, if
Right.
that's what they want to say, oh, by all means, go and say it. But for a Christian, absolutely unacceptable because
Hmm.
we're a people that are called to show self-control. We're a people to be known first for our love, for our patience, for our behavior, to not take vengeance, if you will, knowing that vengeance is the Lord.
Hmm.
Surely we are people who should be concerned for the innocent. And at times when you find yourself destroying property, then what statement is that making?
Sure.
I mean, I've heard people even to the point to say, well, I've seen it in social media enough to know that it's a thread that's out there. It's a part of the narrative
Yes.
that would
Yes.
say, well, these big companies, they have insurance, they'll get their money back anyway. I mean, what sort of rationale is that? So therefore, I can destroy property because I know someone is going to be repaid for that. That's thoroughly unbiblical.
Well, Brother Carl, I know another perspective out there. I know Trevor Noah had talked about this on his program. He was talking about the social contract, and this obviously is from outside the
Sure,
biblical context, right?
sure.
It's like if people are getting upset about a burning of a building, a loss of a business, why are they not as upset about the loss of a life, right?
Yeah,
And having that contrast there.
that's a scapegoat.
Mm,
And I say that's a scapegoat. See, what you said is I can't have both. And this is something I just had conversations with people about recently. What happens is there are people that are in the world. They want to tell us at times we cannot have both positions. I cannot mourn over George Floyd's death, but also have a disappointment, even anger towards someone destroying property. That's not true. I can have both. I can have both. I can mourn over George Floyd's life, but also still support the police overall.
mm,
Yeah. But I think what's happened out there, there's this mindset. Here's this paradigm. And if you don't fit into this paradigm and how you assess the situation, then you are deemed any number of words or
right.
phrases. You're not woke. You're racist. Your voice should not even be heard. You're not worthy to be considered. And it's unfortunate. So I'm not going to allow anyone to put me in sort of a box like that.
Mm,
I can
mm,
think both ways. I can be angry over a life and angry over someone destroying property. I'm not angry over the things, even if they were my own things. I wouldn't be angry over the things. I'm angry and disappointed because I see this manifestation of sin, and I
yeah.
do see people who are in fact innocent that are hurt by it. So, say for instance, if the looters, let's just say by way of argument, if they only targeted the largest retailers who surely have enough insurance to pay back, and they did not hurt small businesses, the mom and pop stores, then maybe you might have some sense of an argument. I would still disagree with it. But if
Right.
we're trying to follow that chain of thought, so why is it that the small business is destroyed? Why is it that the mom and pop place is destroyed as well? Because at times in that what became at times a mob mentality, no one is thinking that way. This is all raw emotion.
No one has it all mapped out. It's like, oh, this one
No,
is like
no,
a
they're
Fortune
not.
500 company. This one is a
No,
small
yeah,
mom and pop.
exactly. Yeah, no
So we'll
one's
leave this
thinking
one
that
alone.
way. Because I remember back in the day when the Rodney King riots, there were people that would paint black on, to say, hey, don't destroy my place, destroy the next one.
Sure.
And some of that happened too. So you saw people boarding up and they put on front BLM.
Yeah.
Oh well,
Yeah.
they don't really support it, but they're
Right.
trying to save their business. Well, okay, if that's be savvy about it. If you think that's going to help you, help you. So there's a mindset that happens in these environments where the rawness and the ugliness of mankind comes out. I can denounce both. I have to.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's where I think
It's not,
there's
and it's not contradicting one
no, it's
another. It might
not.
be contradicting from the world's perspective, but it's not
Yeah,
contradicting from
yeah,
a
it
biblical
is.
point of view.
Yeah, it's contradicting from the world because they can't see how you can denounce both. I can hurt for George Floyd's family, and I can hurt for the person who got his business burned down. Because they're both, I'm hurting ultimately because it's a manifestation of sin and man left to himself and without the intervention of God in his life, then this is what he will do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there thoughts in regards to a response from a Christian and their individual response versus the church's response?
Sure, that's a good thing. I think the individual has to make their own conscious decision, and also how do I say, constrained by their conscience. What is their conscience leading them to do, as opposed to the church? Should the church say, it's in the bulletin, we're going to march on
Mm,
Saturday night? But at the same time, will a bunch of individuals in that church gather their friends, maybe even inquire in their Bible study, we would like to go and peacefully be a part of a demonstration? Then go and do it. Yeah. But take into account, first of all, some guidelines may be necessary. make sure who you're affiliating with
Right.
are not people that would undermine your own faith and you're supporting them. Make sure that you have an exit plan if and when it turns sour, that you can not participate in it any longer, and not place your level of freedom on someone else, your liberty on someone else. Why aren't you doing it? And that's what I see happening in the church. You should be in the forefront as well. If you were a good Christian, you would march. If you were a good Christian, you would do
It's
that.
almost shaming them.
No, it's shaming them, and that's unacceptable. And then you have on the other side, how can you possibly go out and march? That's unacceptable. There are a bunch of unbelievers that are out there. How can you join with them in this march? And so now there's this infighting even in the church itself, where I think ultimately, and here's another thing that I mentioned. I found this curious because under the COVID, when churches weren't meeting, and it wasn't really directed at churches, although I think in some levels of government in certain areas, they were more than happy that churches couldn't meet. But for right now, let's just conclude that, okay, it's simply because of your size. Here are the rules and regulations for COVID, period, so they can't meet. And I saw a number of brothers and sisters then appealing to the Constitution. Well, this amendment tells us that we have this freedom to meet. And so they want to appeal to that. But what I find to be hypocritical is this. Well, also, I have the right to peaceful protest or demonstration.
Yeah.
So now when a believer appeals to that, says, I have the right to have peaceful presentation, then some of these other believers are saying, wait a minute, why are you appealing to secular laws or amendments? Well, you did the same thing when it came to us meeting, as opposed to strictly what Scripture says.
Right.
So you cannot have it both ways. Or you can't have it only your way. It's a better way of stating it. Really. Yeah. It has
Can you talk a little bit about that, continuing the church environment? There are certain elders and leaders in churches that have a stance in regards to this, and yet at the same time, there are going to be church members that have a different perspective or point of view. What's your guidance there in regards to shepherding in light of that?
That's a good question. So if leaders have made a stance, you cannot then dictate to your congregation on this matter, because it's not a matter of sin. Yeah, this is a matter of freedom. Now, if as a group, say for instance, I would warn people about any official affiliation with the organization BLM. It's anti-Christian. It really is.
Can you talk a little bit? I want you to elaborate on that, but continue on that point. Sure. But eventually, we'll elaborate on that too.
It's anti-Christian, and so I cannot possibly have an official affiliation with that organization as a Christian. It undermines my faith, and I believe the organization itself, as it develops, which is quite sad, will play a strategic role in undermining our faith. As it grows, as it's funded more and more, it will do more, I think, to undermine our faith. All one needs to do is to read, I'll call it their manifesto, if you will, and you realize that this is anti-Christian. It's anti-family, it's anti-Christian. So I cannot have any official affiliation with it. So I think a leader can instruct his church in that way, and then that has to be applied to their own conscience, if you will. But at the same time, as an individual, I don't think a pastor can tell anyone, well, you should not, or you had better not. Maybe that's a statement. If you went and demonstrated peacefully, that would be a sin. I don't believe that it is a sin. Yeah, because, the Scripture tells us that we should be a people who are known to be peaceable, but I can still peaceably demonstrate. I cannot possibly riot. There's so many violations in rioting: self-control, patience, love, kindness, mercy. Those are all violated in rioting. Even the qualifications for an elder. He's not one who, he's not one for picking fights. He doesn't resolve issues through fighting. That's rioting. So
Yeah.
how can I possibly participate in that? I can't.
Right. But I think ultimately, too, as a sheep or as a member, sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm back on.
Yeah, I see you.
Perfect. Sorry about that. It's a conversation that you need to have as a church member. If you have a disagreement in regards to your leader's perspective in light of this specific topic, that's a conversation that you'll need to have and possibly ultimately submit to
Sure.
um, to their guidance or what their stance is in regards to
Sure.
that, right?
Yeah, I think so. And one has to make a decision to say, well, do I respect this leader enough to,
Mm,
hear what they're saying? They are trying to watch over my soul. If there's been an open door for communication with them and we've talked it through, here's my thinking, help me understand your guidance. And then now I have to make a decision as to
right,
what I'm going to do. Now, I've
right,
heard kind of, and this is sad too, even this morning when I was on a call, some of the men are saying, and even some of their churches or churches they're aware of, that people have left their church
right,
because they didn't take a strong enough stance on this
right.
issue. And I said, then what's strong enough? What is your expectation? Because we all know often in relationships, the things that can harm the relationship the most are expectations that aren't met, are expectations that are unrealistic,
Mm-hmm,
right? And so now the question is, how much is enough? What do you want me to say? How much time do I need to give to the pulpit to addressing these
mm-hmm,
issues?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And at some point in time, you have to say, well, friend, this may not be the place for you.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, because that's not going to change.
right,
Um, Something as widely recognized as what happened recent with George Floyd, uh, I think every pulpit should have talked about it in
mm.
some
At
way.
least by now.
By now, you should have. But that doesn't mean that every soundbite or every incident that I need to stop what I'm preaching in the pulpit and address it. I would always be preaching on injustice in society.
Mm-hmm,
I would never make my way through a text
mm-hmm,
because there's always something that is taking place. And then
mm-hmm,
I have to say, well, what if it's an injustice that's happening that really doesn't affect us? It's overseas. So am I showing an insensitivity because, well, that's over
right.
there, I don't care about it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
that's why I think even in a local church, there may be a time in a local church where that pastor decides, I need to address this because it's really affecting us locally. It's not even on a national level, but it's significant to us. And that becomes a part of shepherding the flock among you. It's our
right,
congregation, it's affecting us. Other people may never hear about it, but they know about it and it's affecting them, then address it if you
yeah,
deem it profitable.
let's see. Can we go into a little bit in regards to the Black Lives Matter or Black Lives movement? And yeah, in regards to it's, I feel like it almost comes down to semantics, right? Because there's no multiple umbrellas. There's one umbrella in regards to if we are in support, then we're supporting under the hashtag of Black Lives Matters, or there's no like subcategory or
No,
sub hashtag.
I wish there was a hashtag that said BLM organization. So it should be BLMO. If we had
Uh-huh.
hashtag BLMO, so I could say, no, I don't want that hashtag, but I'll still go with Black Lives Matters, hashtag people. I don't know. But
Mm-hmm.
now these two have become mixed. But I still think we need to fight to make that distinction. That no, my nephew, and I've said this several times now just because it's been appropriate, one of my nephews, probably now 3 years ago, asked me this question: Uncle Carl, what can you support BLM? And I said, no, I can't support it as an organization, but the concept, absolutely, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Organization, no, it's contrary to my Christian beliefs. But I'm not offended, nor should I think anyone be offended with the hashtag. Now, we have people that are fighting back because they think the moment you say Black Lives Matter, that you're saying no other lives really matter to you. And that's
Right.
not it at all. It's
Mm-hmm.
like me, in one sense, saying unborn lives matter. The child in the womb matters. It could be me saying, if I knew in a given country a certain people group, which we've seen around the world, are being oppressed. If I were to say those lives matter, I'm just saying right now, let's bring this to the forefront of our discussion and talk about it a bit more. That's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's not work ourselves up over this. But that's the nature of these conversations, because they become at times so emotive that we cannot make those clear distinctions. And a part of the rhetoric that happens in these situations is, unless you embrace us fully, you don't embrace us at all.
Hmm.
And so now it's this idea, because you don't embrace us fully, then you're against us.
Right.
If you're not for us, then you're against us. Well, I'm for some of the things that you hope to achieve, but I'm absolutely against you as an organization. And I think in the minds of some people that those two can't coexist, which is
Do you feel like, oh, I'm sorry to
No, go
interrupt you,
ahead.
but do you feel like you needed this, you had to outright distinguish that? So in regards to, because right now the hottest topic is regards to defunding the police, right?
Sure,
And your
right.
perspective on that,
Sure.
or like we were talking about before, if you're for Black Lives Matter, are you saying that you're against Blue Lives that matter? Are
Yeah,
you
that's
against?
it. No, you're not. You shouldn't be.
And but do
Absolutely.
you have to like say that explicitly, or are you impacting? Are you hurting your potential impact to the African American community by saying that, by not saying
Well,
that?
yeah, that can change, I think, with environments and with people. Let me just make the statement. I think you can be for both, and you should be for both. Now, do you have to say it? It seems like you have to.
Hmm.
In today's environment, you have to say it. I'm not going to go through that extra exercise to distinguish that every time.
Hmm.
I'm sorry. That's just too laborious. I mean, it really is. If you
Right.
want to get to know me and what I believe, then get to know me. If you want to take my comment out of context, you're going to take it out of context. It's
Hmm.
like in preaching. Sometimes in preaching, you cannot always address every nuance when you're preaching. No, you should be clear, but you cannot address every possible situation, every possible thought, every possible person that's sitting and listening to you. You can't do that. And it's the same thing with some of these matters now. I shouldn't have to say, well, Black Lives Matter. I don't mean the organization. And I'm also for Blue Lives Matter as well. I can't say that on every occasion.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that sort of is a ball and chain that's been placed around the necks of some people, and I refuse to wear it.
Hmm. I for me as an Asian American and
Sure.
having Black Black friends, African American friends, and wanting to show support, and yet at the same time knowing how to navigate through that. So anybody who has friends who are African American, who are not African American themselves, and knowing how to show support, what would you say be your best advice in regards to showing support? Does it
Yeah.
have to be like that one week on Tuesday we had to all black out our screens for social media purposes? Does it have to say that we have to post hashtag Black Lives Matter? Like, is there like a rule book of like this is what it means to
Yeah.
show that you're supporting?
Yeah. You know, the problem with it is there's several rule books out there. It's like rules, but the problem with it is the rules change. The goalpost keeps changing. You know, I literally looked up a rule recently I wasn't even aware of in golf that has changed. Actually, this last year they changed the rule that you can leave the flag in when you putt before you had to take it out, because if you had it in and it hit the flag and went in, that was a penalty. Da 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 da. That rule changed. Another rule I wasn't even aware of. Someone told me if you hit the ball in the bunker, you can actually lift it out and then take a penalty. Because if you say to yourself, "Hey, I'm no way I'm going to get this out. I'll take my penalty." I didn't know that. The rules changed, right? Now, that's a
Mm-hmm.
trivial example, but it changes. The rule book changes, and it's going to change from individual to individual. Um, so, what I see right now is the rule book, right? Presently, with certain organizations, is you have to absolutely be 100% in with me on my rhetoric, my position, and my approach. And if not, you're not with me.
Right.
Unacceptable. So, on a personal level, which we need to do more of this on a personal level, when you say support, I just think you have conversations with people. Let's go back to the basics. Maybe you have your friends and let's all do a big Zoom call and let's talk about this. That's what you do.
Mhm.
You know, some of your friends may say, "Hey, I'm going to go to this walk. Do you want to go with me?" Others are going to say, "Well, I'm glad that you just listened to me." Others are going to say, "You know what? I'm really not bothered by this. I've not had any bad experiences whatsoever." But I want to sympathize towards those that do. Go back to what we used to do, actually just talking to one another instead
Mm,
of tweeting out and Facebook posting in
mm,
lieu of it. Now,
mm,
Twitter, Facebook, other forms of social media, Instagram, can they be useful tools? Sure, they can. Like what we're doing right now. It's a useful tool because at some point in time, we were not able to do this.
right.
Um, but when it comes to that personal level, people that you know, talk with them, get to know them is what you should do.
Mm,
And then we can use social media at times to extend it to a larger audience of people that we may never personally engage with, and it can be beneficial. Almost like we can have a family meeting without everyone even being here and not everyone even being in the family. But if you have those people that are in that family of yours, your friends and close ones, have the conversation with them
yeah.
and hear from them.
In regards to apologizing,
Yeah.
um,
Oh my.
I think we're seeing a variety of responses in regards to that. I think for myself, I've noticed like, oh wow, I've been silent for way too long. It's like you notice what was very hard was just watching Ahmaud Arbery, and
Yeah.
that's just like, and just not knowing what to respond and not responding, in regards to being guilty of that, and apologizing for being silent. But I think people are starting to notice like it's almost the same effect of like that goalpost keeps getting moved. Like I
Sure.
apologized before. Do I
Yeah.
need to continue to apologize
Sure.
for my past actions, even though I've recognized that and I'm changing and evolving in that regard? So in regards to that, whether it be from a personal perspective or even from a public perspective,
Sure. Yeah, that's
making
a
an
good
apology.
question. Yeah, because now we see a great deal of that. We hear leaders who are now, someone just told me of an example of the CEO for Chick-fil-A who went and he kneeled down and shined the shoes of Lecrae. I don't know what is that? And
Mm,
he admitted that not his own prejudice, but maybe his silence on issues or prejudice he had within him he wasn't even aware of. Well, if that's your individual decision, go ahead and make it. But you cannot impress that upon me to say that that's the way that I need to show that I'm sorry. And what you have to also do is this: is there something you should be sorry for? What am I? I'm not going to by proxy just make um, this symbol of repentance.
mm,
What am I? What issues have been in my heart? If you've had issues in your heart, surely apologize to friends if that's been the case. But if not, I'm not going to make an apology for something that's not been in my heart. That's thoroughly unbiblical. And that's what's happening now because a part of the mindset is, well, you are inherently even racist or you have a certain sense of prejudice in you. You're not even aware of it. And now we have introduced almost like pop psychology to this dialogue, which shouldn't be. Like I said, if a person can, in their own conscience, knows that I have been purposely silent or fearful in speaking
mm,
up, then make it right with the people you need to make it right with. That's what you
mm,
should do.
mm.
And I'm sorry about that. Sure. Okay, great. I accept your apology. Let's move on. But if now I need to keep doing this, when is
Yeah,
this going to be satisfied? And to how many people do I do this with? Do I write an open letter to all African Americans in America? And if I receive that letter, I don't know you.
right.
What does that mean to me necessarily that you've done that? And this is where it has to be on a personal level. If there are organizations, say for instance, if an organization, if they were, because of their upper management they were operating with prejudice and hiring practices and such. And they wanted to say, we've noticed something, we've done our own audit, and this was a pattern. We are so sorry for this. Sure, go ahead and do it. That might be acceptable. But these individual apologies for issues in the heart, which I've never had or a person's never had, I think they're meaningless, actually. Symbolic. They're symbolic, and they can be used in the rhetoric that we find ourselves in today, but it's not biblical at all.
I think I'm gathering too, because there's public perception, right? Like if you're not posting these things, I'm using a lot about social media, right? Because when people look at you, if they don't know you or they don't know you that well or they've lost touch, they just look at your posts. Oh, I didn't see you post this, or you posted about this, and so like, okay, I can accept you back into the group. But in reality, it's more of like, these are personal relationships, unless you are, like you were talking about, being a corporation, having those practices. These are personal things that you should be hashing out with people in the relationships you have, not necessarily before the world. And it shouldn't necessarily matter how the world judges you in that regard, because if you know out of the heart and your intentions were correct and pure in that regard, then that should be okay.
Sure, absolutely. It should be okay. That's biblical, that it be that way. And forgiveness, repentance, if there has been a wrong done, comes with restitution. So a company, if they know they've had those practices, then somehow they need to make a way to make that right, if that's been the occasion. Yeah.
Pastor Carl, I know you are running up against the time, but I have several more questions. What's a hard stop for you before?
The hard stop is 4. Okay, well, perfect. In about, looks like 12 minutes.
Got it. What do you think in regards to, besides just apologizing, what would be additional things that could be helpful?
Yeah, and that's where that individual conversation comes in. That it may mean, brothers, let's sit and have a roundtable discussion about these issues. Can we hear my heart on it? How do we see it? How do we view it? But that for a Christian then must be guided by Scripture. What does God have us? What does God say about these issues? And let's talk about it. What does it mean to love one another? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And when it says love your neighbor as yourself, that is not limited to the Christian neighbor loving the Christian neighbor. It's simply your neighbor. So what is that going to look like for me? And to have discussions with people about that, I think is helpful. I think that if a person says, if they feel in their own conscience, well, they've been silent about it, but they've spoken to many other issues, if you will, then now, brother, it would be helpful that maybe you break that silence on this issue.
Yeah.
And whether it be on your blog, whether it be on your posts, that you can say something about it. That would show me that you understand it better. If we went back to something like, say, for instance, abortion, which is clearly an injustice. Now it's an absolute, at least for us to believe that life begins in the womb. It's an absolute. Some racism, how do we capture it? Sometimes we can't capture it. The issue of abortion is an absolute. A life is taken. Racism, it's not always as easy to capture it and to say that's that's an example of racism. But if a person, say, for instance, had been silent on the issue of abortion, and they had a number of friends that were very passionate about this issue itself, and they have a discussion, and they may say to you, Will, I've noticed you've never said anything about it. Why is that? And they say, well, it would just help that if you took some of this conversation we had and you commented on it, that may be a helpful thing to do. Just like it's been helpful for people to comment on what's happening. Now, when I say what's happening now with the issue of racial tensions. And I think, of course, we know that there's a lot of good that's out there in social media, but there's a lot of garbage. There really is. There are a lot of posts that come from ignorance and insensitivity and party lines. That's simply what we say. We'll always say it this way. There are people that I know that they won't even concede when you say, well, there are a few bad apples in the police force. In their mind, no, they would say, and had a friend actually say, no, the whole barrel is bad. The whole
Mm,
system is bad. There may be systems in certain districts in certain areas that are corrupt. I concede that because you have sinners, and
mhm.
sometimes those sinners they come together. Like even the Proverbs say, they come together to do evil, and that could in fact be true. So you need to have those conversations with people about what may be helpful with them. I just want to make it more individual than I
Yeah.
want to make it corporately.
What are your thoughts in regard to the Drew Brees comments? Because I've heard different
Yeah,
commentators talk about that, whether it be from Shannon Sharp, from Stephen A. Smith, or even Tony Dungy himself, and things like that.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, Drew Brees. If we dial back the clock, 3 years ago, he made those statements, and others made this statement, and they weren't chided for it then. So he really just restated what he did some years ago, and now he is the worst of the worst.
yes,
He found himself again in an ugly cycle of apologizing and apologizing and backtracking, which is unfortunate. And if you listen to the entirety of his comments, it was directed very specifically at dishonoring the flag itself. It wasn't a commentary on what happened with George Floyd or anything surrounding that at all. But once that wave of criticism came, it pushed him over. And that's unfortunate. Um, because now in the present environment, you remember the three words I said when we started: context, context, context. In the present context, it's absolutely unacceptable.
right.
Whereas before it was understandable. Some may have said, I differ with you, but I understand where you're coming from, Drew, because especially since with Drew Brees, all that he's done in New Orleans over all the years, how is it now that that's just discarded because of this statement that he made, which is the same statement he made years ago? And see, that's the mentality that happens. That's where I
Mhm.
think we lose objectivity, and we're unwilling to say, wait a minute, hold on. Drew Brees and his track record surely speaks against it. So let's understand what he meant before we attempt to crucify him.
Right. It's almost like you can't make a public statement
No,
unless
you
you
can't.
have it run through
No,
multiple PR firms and things like that to
no,
make
no,
sure that it's correct.
no. You can't, because what happens now is you need to put your finger up and which way is it blowing before I say anything, and then that I think makes men. It can make some men become cowards,
Yeah.
and I'm speaking about men who should be speaking to issues morally, mainly pastors and spiritual leaders. Then they become cowards, and they're not making statements. But of course, the statements that we should make are biblical ones.
Mm.
But that was really kind of sad to see that unfold the way that it did. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was sad. I know we're running up against the clock, about 5 minutes, but I do want to talk about your experience with John MacArthur and the post that you just recently made. What was that experience like? What did you guys talk about? I'm sure you aren't able to get into all the details,
Yeah,
but
not all
just
the
wanted to hear a
details
little
of it.
about that.
Yeah, it was just an opportunity that arose at Grace Community Church with John MacArthur to talk with him about some of his recent messages, and also how do we shepherd people through this time where there can be a great deal of confusion, terms that are used that are offensive that weren't offensive in the past, understanding the hearts of people. Um, and it was just a wonderful conversation that we had with him about even the power of his voice that he has, and how God has used it and can use it during these times. We discussed the issue of, say, for instance, one thing that I can say this that came up was about systemic racism.
Mm.
And there's some of us, we disagreed on what that means, because I think that's another moving goalpost. So the conclusion was that the moment you talk about, say, for instance, systemic racism, or is it institutionalized racism? Is it organized racism? But let's just talk about racism, period. Now, the Bible clearly denounces it. And the Bible clearly denounces cognitive, racism. What's happening now is people can be, they're branded, well, you really don't know that you're racist, but you truly are. What? Now where is this racism coming from? You're just unaware of your racism. Or you act in racist ways and you're unaware of those actions. Now, are there people that can be insensitive? And this is where we go wrong. We even talked about distinguishing between racism, ignorance, and insensitivity. There are people that have said things to me, my family, that I would deem to be insensitive but not racist. But today, what has happened, any insensitivity is deemed racist. And I think what it does, it causes the word racism and race to lose its substance. Now, there are people that also want to argue, and we talked about this a little bit, not much. Well, we shouldn't even talk about racism or race because that's not biblical. We're all from one race and we have different ethnicities. Well, that's true. And let's concede that. And you have to concede it. But then if it's not called racism, then what is it called then? Ethnicism, call it what you want. Then that's when we get into a semantic game that's really not that important. That doesn't matter to me. Call it what you want. But we know that people do view people differently based on their ethnicity. And if you're uncomfortable saying it's race, okay, then don't call it race, call it ethnicity. We know that happens. That's a reality. So we discussed some of that. We discuss how we can stay focused on our gospel message, because as we look at this tide of the social gospel bleeding its way into the church, under sometimes the guise right now of the social justice movement. So now how do we stay on track? And even the idea of social justice, like personally, when I hear social justice, and I've said this before, even at Grace Church in one of our workshops we did in the summer, the idea itself doesn't bother me, but I know that at some point in time, I may have to drop the idea because it's so associated with that, I have to give it up. Because justice, let's look at it plainly, justice is experienced and manifest in society.
Yeah.
And so God wants justice. Now, justice doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens amongst people, amongst the culture, amongst the society. Now, I know that idea has been hijacked, and I may have to simply give it up at some point in time. But I've told people it doesn't bother me to say we should want social justice.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry to cut you off. For those who, final questions.
Sure.
For those who are not African American, what do you think their major takeaway should be? What would you say the major takeaway from this conversation, or your encouragement or exhortation to them would be?
Yeah, that are not African Americans. First, unless it's a matter of your own heart, don't let anyone guilt you into anything. That now, just because of who you are, you should feel some sense of shame or guilt. That's unacceptable. Now, in your own heart, if you know that you've had prejudice in your own heart, or bigotry in your own heart, repent of it. God disdains it. So do that. I think for those that are not African Americans that look at this situation, I just say to them, if you have friends, co-workers, that maybe you can just initiate a conversation with them and just talk with them about it, but not in a way that's patronizing, but just in a way that I want to understand what you're thinking. And I believe that different people are going to give you different perspectives because their lives are different. Yeah, how it's affected me is different than how it's affected someone else that may be in the same ethnicity. I want to understand you as an individual, not as this corporate body, because I have to speak for myself individually. And that's where, say, for instance, when we reverse that, we would always take issue with it because we would say, wait a minute, you're prejudiced. You've already judged me simply by the color of my skin. And we also have to think about it from the standpoint, I want to be an individual, so let me have an individual conversation with you and hear how you think. Not, oh, you're African American, then you're for this. No, not necessarily. It's no different than the ridiculous statement of Joe Biden, who said, if you don't vote for me, then you're not black. I mean, my goodness, man. You kidding me?
What would be your encouragement and exhortation be to the African American communities or African American?
Sure. I mean, to them is first that are in the church, just like in the civil rights movement, one, and it's an excellent series to watch, Eyes on the Prize. And the sense of the eyes on the prize was always to say, keep our eyes on the prize as we go through this, as we would boycott, as we would walk, instead of taking the bus. Keep your eyes on the prize, that one day as we fight for equality, it will come. And so keep your eyes on the prize. And so if I say that as a Christian, keep my eyes on the prize, which is what Paul said in Philippians 3, for the prize, for the upward call. So that's the prize that I have to continue to look at and make sure that I'm focused on that prize. And in the midst of it, what I want to do is to make sure that I don't ever lose my ultimate calling, which is, as I focus on that prize, I'm demonstrating Christian love to my brothers along the way, and I'm preaching the gospel to them so that they can get their eyes on that ultimate prize. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Brother Carl, in regards to best way to reach out to you in regards to questions, speaking engagements, things like that, what's the best way to reach out to you?
You can reach out to me. I'm on Facebook. You can look me up on Facebook and also on Twitter. Just Carl Hargrove, at Carl Hargrove on Twitter. Facebook, I'm there as well. You can email me. That would be fine as well. You can even just email me. I'll give you my personal email, carlhargrove@icloud.com. You can do that. So Facebook, Twitter, I think Instagram. I don't use Instagram as much, but Facebook, Twitter is fine. We can go from there. All right.
All right, Dr. Hargrove, thank you so much for your time. I know it's a little bit over. I appreciate breaking the time in the conversation.
Yeah. All right. Take care now.
Family, stay safe. Take care.
All right.
Bye for now.